Thank you. Pair instability supernova. There are many types of supernovas, as I discussed in the What's Up I did last year. These, the pair instability supernova, may be some of the most interesting. It's, by the way, not a pair unstable souped-up nova. This happens only for massive stars over approximately 100 solar masses. And when I start talking about solar masses, that's obviously the mass of our sun. All of these numbers are approximate. But first, a quick review of particle physics to give you an idea of what's going on. According to the standard model of particle physics, every particle has an antiparticle with the same characteristics, but opposite charge and sometimes opposite spin. There are electrons and anti-electrons, also known as positrons. There are protons, antiprotons. There is even anti-atoms. The pair that we're talking about in the pair instability supernova are the positron and electron. When an antiparticle meets its particle, they annihilate. That's on the right side of the diagram here. Produces a very energetic photon, a gamma ray. The reverse of this process is also possible, the positron-electron creation from a very energetic photon. This, by the way, demonstrates Einstein's mass energy equivalence, E equals mc squared. To make a positron electron pair, you need a very high energy gamma ray. The photon must be near a nucleus in order to satisfy the conservation of momentum. Because of this, when the pair production occurs, the atomic nucleus receives some recoil. Photon must have higher energy than the rest masses of the positron and electron, about 1 million electron volts. This only happens in the core of stars that have a temperature above about 300 million degrees. The positron was first found or discovered in 1930s by C.D. Anderson. Really like this picture. In stars, any size stars, at the core is a fusion reaction, creating energy photons, which create pressure to keep the star from collapsing due to gravity. This establishes equilibrium between the energy produced and the gravity. Too much energy and the star starts to expand, which quenches the fusion reaction. Too much gravity and an increase in nuclear fusion, or the star may collapse to a black hole or a neutron star. So for stars less than 100 solar masses, the gamma rays don't have sufficient energy to produce the electron-positron pairs. We'll continue on to normal, what stars do, supernovas, white dwarfs, whatever. In stars of 100 to 130 solar masses, we're calling these pulsation pair instability supernovas. Gamma rays have enough energy to create the electron-positron pairs. The recombination of the electron-positron pairs, the destruction, is slower than the creation of the pairs. This reduces the thermal pressure holding the star in equilibrium. The star starts to shrink, but the star does not have enough mass to have a complete core collapse. The reduction in pressure and partial collapse will cause increased fusion. The increased fusion increases the thermal pressure, puffing out the outer layers of the star, and reducing the rate of fusion, and the star starts to shrink again, starting the process over. This pulsation can continue until the mass is too small to continue, less than 100 solar masses. Here we have a diagram of what they think is happening in these large stars. You have pressure, you have gravity, you have the pairs being created, and the pressure is less than the gravity, causing the collapse. An example of a pair instability, pulsation pair instability supernova may be Eta Carinae, which became the second brightest star in the sky in March of 1843, before fading well below naked eye visibility after 1856. By the way, the material's getting pushed out from the star, which is at the center of that dumbbell shape, is the material being sloughed off of as the star got larger. In stars of 130 to approximately 250 solar masses, the gamma rays have enough energy to create the electron-positron pairs. A reduction in pressure resulting in a partial collapse of the star, which further ignites massive runaway fusion. The runaway fusion blows the whole star to pieces. The remains of the star is dispersed, enriching the galaxy with elements heavier than helium and hydrogen. And astrophysicists speak metals. The result, no black hole, no neutron star, nothing but a massive amount of ejecta. In stars over 250 solar masses, again, you have enough energy to create the pairs, electron pairs, causing a collapse. And another mechanism kicks in, photodisintegration, which also absorbs energy. And the collapse continues until it leaves a black hole. It may result in a gamma ray flash, but the result is a black hole with no large amounts of ejecta. So how do we even know that these things exist? We have a listing of possible pair instability supernova, SN 2006 GY up to SN 2016 IET. The light curves for these are quite different from common types of supernova. The light curves are quite highly extended, with peak luminosities occurring months after the onset. And this is due to the extreme amount of radioactive nickel-56 expelled and the optically dense ejecta from the supernova. One of these, SN 2016 APS, is the brightest supernova yet recorded. It may be a pulsation pair instability supernova. And the two images that you see here, the one on the left, after 362 days, is fairly bright. And the one on the right, after almost 3 years, you can finally start to see the host galaxies. These images were manipulated so that they are approximately the same brightness, although they were taken from different optical instruments. So there you have it. Questions? If you have questions, I may have answers.
Steve, on the slide that says 150 to 250, it says, yeah.
130 to 250.
130 to 250. Reduced pressure causes the collapse of the core. I would think that reduced pressure would cause an end to fusion. Why would it cause a collapse of the core?
Again, you have two things that are trying to balance. You have gravity trying to squash it together, and you have energy trying to push it apart, keep it apart. The thermal.
Oh, this is a reduced internal pressure,
Yes.
not, okay, I see.
Yes.
And now there's nothing to hold the outer
That
energy.
hold the gravity from collapsing it. Correct.
Got it.
Sorry, that wasn't clear. Other questions? Yes, no?
Hey, Steve,
Yes.
what example do they have of the situation where there's nothing left behind? How have they been able to determine that? Is that radio astronomy or other things?
Yeah, I was afraid somebody was going to ask that.
Sorry about that.
No problem. These are fairly hypothetical. The only one that they are fairly certain about to date is SN 2016 APS. Now, some of the others have these extended light curves. So they're not exactly sure what the process is in there. You would think if you had something as big as one of the over 250 solar masses, that would, but because you have a very bright large star that just goes away with maybe a gamma ray flash, how would you ever know?
That's true. Sure. Well, good. That's why I was wondering whether they had very many examples. It sounds like they have an example of one that they know of. So.
Well, these, all of those.
Well, the ones that leave behind, of course, are like regular neutron stars, and they could be gamma ray bursters. They could do whatever they want to do, but we're just looking at it in a small slice of time. So
Yes, correct. And the slice of time is, of course, the time since we've been actually looking for.
Right, exactly.
Any other questions, comments, complaints? Yes.
What's the time frame from when the balance is not maintained until either a supernova or a black hole is formed?
That's a really good question. For these type of supernovas, I don't think they know. For a regular type 1 or type 2 supernova, it can be anywhere from minutes to seconds. So when it starts to collapse, the whole thing goes to pot, and it just keeps collapsing. So it can happen extremely fast. With no more questions. If anybody was interested.
Got a question, Steve.
Okay.
These stars undergo visual or visible pulsations as they're leading up to that final event?
I don't believe they do. One of the things that we don't know is what happens before, because there's a whole lot of stars out there, right? And you have to kind of work your way backward. Once you find an event, then you have to say, well, was anybody looking at it before this happened? So I don't know, quite honestly. The pulsation pair instability, that's going to happen over a very long period of time. The example that we had was Eta Carinae. It hasn't done it since the 1800s. But the idea is that it could do it again.
Well, so what's got to start to happen is over time, that core has to start to heat up to generate high enough energy gamma rays to trigger the formation
Right.
That would be neutrino, antineutrino, or electron and positron.
Right.
And what's causing that increase in temperature?
Increase in temperature. What? No. What happens is just the other way around. The
Well, gravitation.
increase in the gamma rays, or I'm sorry, the electron-positron pairs reduces the number of gamma rays, which reduces the pressure holding it out, so it starts to collapse. And the collapse will cause more fusion.
So then the star either pulses out or collapses catastrophically.
No, it could stay stable for a while.
I would think it would oscillate.
You would think. I mean,
Steve, could I make a comment?
certainly.
You're talking about very massive stars here, and these would be called the population 3 stars, which were the first stars formed in the universe. They were very massive because there were not in that time much of a concentration of carbon and oxygen and the heavier elements that help gas cool. So if you have only hydrogen and helium, the gas doesn't cool effectively, and so you need a much larger mass to collapse and form a star. Well, those stars are very short-lived, and they're not produced in the late universe or even in the middle-aged universe. So we are necessarily looking at stars that are extremely far away. These massive stars probably only lived a few million years, and they existed billions of years ago. So they are just at the edge of what anyone can observe, which is why most of this is very hypothetical, because we don't have a lot of examples. It's even some of the images that you showed of 2016 ATS, those aren't stunning pictures of stars, right? I mean, they're highly pixelated.
Right.
They're taken by the greatest telescopes we have. So this is really at the cutting edge.
Right. I should say that 2016 APS is 3.6 billion light years distant. So you're right.
Yeah, but Eta Carinae is not even outside of our galaxy.
Right.
So it can't be as one of those first stars in the evolution of the universe.
It may not be the first star, but also you can have stars combining to create the large mass.
Okay.
And it is a very large star, as we know that. All right. If there aren't any other questions, then we will go ahead and have our 5-minute break before we start up our main speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Robert Piccioni. Can life be merely an accident? Dr. Piccioni did his undergraduate at Caltech, his PhD in high energy physics from Stanford. He's principal of 8 high-tech companies, an Osher Institute instructor at UCLA and CSUCI, where students selected Robert as Teacher of the Year. He's the author of 50 books, about half intended for the general audiences. With that, I would like to have Dr. Piccioni take it away.
You are still muted. Unmute, please.
So do you see the slide and hear my voice?
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful.
Good to go.
Well, I believe this is the 3rd time I've had the great pleasure of speaking to the Mount Diablo Astronomical Society. The first 2 times were in person, but this is fun nonetheless. And the talk I'm going to give tonight is somewhat provocative, and I'm going to say things that I may be the only one in the world that believes them. So I will let you know when I stop telling you established science and start telling you my own speculations. That'll come toward the end of the talk. So this beautiful image taken by the Cassini space probe on the backside in the shadow of Saturn. The spacecraft turned the camera toward the inner solar system and took this picture, famously called the pale blue dot. And that dot at the tip of the arrow is Earth. And it's easy to look at pictures like that and think that we are very small and can't be very important to the universe. And indeed, one of the most famous astrophysicists of all times said of this picture that we are but a carbon smudge on an insignificant rock orbiting a humdrum star in an unremarkable galaxy in some forgotten corner of the universe. I mean, really, how depressing is that? But I'm here to tell you tonight that I disagree with every bit of that. I think every aspect of our existence is absolutely remarkable, and I'll talk about some of those aspects tonight, and I hope that you'll agree with me that we are indeed much more than an insignificant smudge on an insignificant rock. Well, the universe is filled with wondrous sights. That's why all of you are astronomers. And I believe the most wondrous phenomenon in the entire universe is the existence of life. Even a humble butterfly is in many ways much more complicated than a galaxy or a star or anything else that you would see in the cosmos. And while I fully believe that Darwin's theory of evolution explains in a very cogent way how species evolve from one generation to the next through the pressures of natural selection and random mutation, Darwin's theory doesn't really address how the very first generation came to be. So the question I want to address is, did the first life arise purely by random chance, by accident, in other words? Did the first life arise by inert chemical compounds hitting each other in just the right way, at just the right time, in just the right place? Or, as most scientists would maintain, or is there something much more complex that we have yet to discover about the origin of the first life? Well, the scientific exploration of this question may be said to have begun in 1952, when the Nobel laureate Harold Urey and his student Stanley Miller put gases together in a glass container, gases that they thought were representative of the atmosphere of the early Earth. They exposed those gases to electric arcs, which mimicked lightning. They cycled the gases through periods of cold and heat, which mimicked day and night. And after a number of days, they looked in the flask and they saw that sludge at the bottom of the flask. And that sludge indeed contained amino acids. Not all the amino acids were present. There were only about half a dozen different types of amino acids. But nonetheless, these are complex molecules, complex organic molecules that we had previously believed were the sole provenance of life. And yet they could be produced by random chemical reactions, as Urey and Miller demonstrated. Now, it seemed at that point that all you had to do maybe was tweak the conditions, and sooner or later, something would crawl out of the tube. Well, that didn't happen. This experiment has been repeated literally hundreds of times in all different combinations with different gases and you know, everything that the scientists can think of varying, and we have only been able to produce sludge. So it was a step, it was an intriguing step, but it was not a completion of a scientific explanation for how life could have formed. Now, scientists adopted many different points of view. The Nobel laureate professor of biology of Harvard, George Wald, said, however improbable the origin of life may seem, given enough time, it will certainly happen, and that it is time itself that performs miracles. No need for God. On the other hand, Francis Crick, also Nobel laureate and the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, said that the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to be satisfied to get it going. So two very different points of view. And perhaps the most articulate point of view was by Sir Fred Hoyle, the gentleman who derisively coined the term Big Bang. And he said, the accidental occurrence of life is about as likely as the assemblage of a 747 by a tornado whirling through a junkyard. Well, very divergent point of views, but none of them really backed up by any data. And when you don't have data, scientists can come up with all sorts of crazy things. Well, so the question is, did the first life originate purely by some accidental chemical and physical process, or does it have some deeper origin? Now, when the argument started 50 years ago, there were so many things that we didn't know that it was just really a matter of debate. But now, in the intervening 50 years, we have discovered a tremendous amount about the size of the universe, the age of the universe, the evolution of our universe. We've discovered much more about the biochemistry of life itself and the physics of planets, stars, and galaxies. So I believe the time has come that we can put numbers to this question and come up with some ideas. So, what are the conditions that are necessary for life to exist? First of all, we started with a dilemma that there is no generally accepted definition for what is life. We know it when we see it, which is something a Supreme Court judge said about pornography, but we have difficulty defining what exactly is the essential condition that makes something alive and something else inert. But I believe that any biological form of life would have to exist in a universe that can support life. And perhaps in a different day, we'll discuss how very unlikely that actually is. Life would have to have certain atoms, as we'll discuss tonight. Life would also have to have a viable habitat, and the only example that we know of a viable habitat is the Earth itself. And finally, life is very complex, and it needs a recipe that defines all of the biological processes that sustain the life, that let it grow and let it finally reproduce and create new life. So all of that is very complex, and the only example that we have of a recipe of life is DNA. This is not to say that there couldn't be a different form for the recipe or a different habitat other than Earth, but they would have to be remarkable, as we will find out as the talk continues. So let's talk briefly about a viable universe. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I'd like to say a few things about what the universe has to be able to support life. Well, as in much of science, this discussion starts with something that Einstein said. He said, he's standing, by the way, on the beach at Santa Barbara in a three-piece suit with long tails. And I've been at that beach many times, and I have to tell you, I've never seen anyone dressed like that at Santa Barbara. But anyway, that was Einstein. He said, what really interested me in my entire life's research was the question of whether God had any choice in the creation of the universe. So as usual, it's sort of a profound and difficult sounding statement. But what I think Einstein had in mind was, do the laws of physics and math, as we know or are yet to discover, do those laws require that the universe has to be pretty much the way we see ours? Or could the universe have indeed been vastly different from the one that we inhabit? And if the answer is the second, then Einstein's next question would be, why did God choose this one out of the variety of other choices? Well, when Einstein asked the question 50 years ago or more, there was no answer to this question. But now in the intervening half century or more, we have many answers to provide. And indeed, it's generally agreed that there are a number of critical parameters to the universe that define its overall characteristics. And I choose to enumerate them in 20 different parameters, and I call them knobs. Other scientists say there are 37 parameters, some even more than that, but I think there are 20 that are critically important. And if you will, you could imagine the analogy of a machine that bakes a cake. So that machine might have a series of knobs on the front. One would control the cooking time, the cooking temperature, the amount of flour, the amount of sugar, ... And you could set the knobs to your recipe, push go, and out would come a cake. And if you just spin the knobs to some random values, you'd probably get a cake that no one would like to eat. But if you choose just the right recipe, then you'll get a delightful cake indeed. And the universe is a bit like that, because it turns out of these 20 knobs, each one of them has a wide range of values, any value of which would satisfy all the known laws of physics and math. So any combination of knobs within a wide range will produce a universe that satisfies everything we know about what a universe needs to be. However, only in a very small range of each of the 20 knobs would you have a universe which could support any form of life whatsoever. Any form of life whatsoever. Because in the vast majority of all the other ranges, you'd have a universe that would almost immediately collapse into a black hole, or would expand so rapidly that there would not be any time for stars to form. And if you can't form stars, you're not going to get the atoms that life requires. So it turns out that these 20 knobs really need to be finely tuned to get a universe that could support life. So Einstein's question has the answer, yes, the universe could have been vastly different. However, we wouldn't exist in the vast majority of those combinations of other possibilities. Only in a very narrow range of each of the 20 knobs do you have a universe that could support any form of life whatsoever. Now, we could talk about that for the whole hour, but that's not the focus of this talk. So let's move on. Let's talk about the atoms that life requires. There have been very creative science fiction movies in which you have this ethereal life, which is like a cloud that floats around and it has no mass, it's all energy and so forth. And that's very intriguing, but it has nothing to do with science, because anything that has zero mass, according to Einstein's theories of relativity, has to be continually moving at the speed of light. And anything moving at the speed of light has no time in its own reference frame. Time comes to a complete standstill at the speed of light, and nothing can ever change. So if this entity were made of pure energy with no mass, it would continually move at the speed of light. It would never change. And that doesn't sound like a description of anything that we would call alive, because change is one of the most important characteristics, I think, of life. So life requires matter, and life requires matter that's reactive so that the biochemical processes that support the life can be performed. So it requires, for instance, dark matter would not be a suitable constituent of any form of life. There's not enough interaction to make something as complex as life. So life does indeed require the atoms that we know of, the atoms on the periodic table of elements. And more than that, life requires carbon. There are only about 10,000 molecules that can be created by all of the elements on the periodic table if you omit carbon. And none of those molecules have more than about a dozen atoms. And that's not nearly complicated enough to store the recipe of any form of life. But there are billions of molecules that you can make that do contain carbon. These are typically long strings of carbon atoms linked one to another with all sorts of other atoms hanging along the chain. And indeed, you can make molecules with carbon that have billions of atoms. So it's only carbon, of all the elements on the periodic table, only carbon is capable of making atoms of any complexity. And so carbon is the absolute essential ingredient to any form of life whatsoever. NASA says that their search for life is to follow the water. And that may be true. Water may be essential to life, but I can't prove that. But carbon is absolutely essential to life, and there's no two ways about that. Okay, so in the early universe, this is the famous cosmic microwave background radiation image. This one is from the WMAP satellite. This shows the universe when it was 1/36,000th of its current age. If you made the comparison of the universe today to a 100-year-old man, then this would be an image of the fetus of that individual 24 hours after the moment of conception. I mean, this is really the baby picture of our universe, the ultimate sonogram of our universe. And back then, we know that the universe contained only two types of atoms, hydrogen and helium. And if you made a copy of the periodic table of elements back then, you just have these two entries. And there wouldn't be a single atom of any of the other 90 elements on the periodic table anywhere in the entire universe. So this is when all of us should have taken high school chemistry. Back then, there was no chemistry. Of course, with no chemistry, there couldn't be any life. So where did the atoms of that life requires come from? They didn't come from the Big Bang. What produced the atoms of life? And as I'm sure many of you know, the atoms of life are created in stars. So this is indeed, I think, the most difficult process that our universe has completed throughout its entire existence. All of the stars in the universe, 30 billion trillion stars, burning furiously for 14 billion years or so, have managed to convert only 2% of the mass of all of the original hydrogen and helium into oxygen, carbon, and all of the other 88 elements on the periodic table of elements. Only 2% of all the atomic mass in the universe is in the atoms that life requires. So these are very rare and special atoms indeed, and they were extremely hard to produce. And some of the knobs that we talked about earlier that describe a universe are critically important in forming stars and in producing these atoms in the center of stars and then distributing those atoms back out into the cosmos, as Steve described when those stars go supernova. So, if you look at the composition of the Earth, 99.99% of the atomic mass of the Earth is in the form of atoms that were produced in stars. Only 1/100th of 1% of all of the atomic mass of Earth is in the hydrogen in the oceans of Earth. Only 1/100th of 1%. Everything else in Earth was produced by a star. And if you look at a human being or any similar form of life, you find that 90% of the atomic mass in a human being are also the atoms produced in stars. The oxygen in blue, the carbon in green. This is the 10% that was produced in the Big Bang, the hydrogen that's in all of our hydrocarbon molecules and also in the water. And the black stripe is all of the other atoms besides hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, including iron. And so 90% of our body mass was produced in stars. We are truly made of stardust. And that twinkle in your loved one's eye really is a little bit of a star. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the Earth and what makes the Earth a special supportive habitat for life. I list in my various books 14 characteristics of the Earth that I think are quite important to making life possible on Earth. I don't claim that any one of these is absolutely essential. You could have life somewhere else that doesn't have some of these properties, but I will say that every one of these properties makes life on Earth much more probable. They all make a major contribution to supporting the existence of life on Earth. And we don't have time to go through 14 of them today, but now that astronomers have found 4,000 planets orbiting other stars, exoplanets, we can put some statistics on about half of these characteristics of Earth. And these are the numbers that I got from the NASA JPL Caltech website on exoplanets. We are in a very favorable place in the galaxy, and the probability of that occurring is 1 in 10. That's not an overwhelmingly unlikely occurrence, but it's still 1 in 10 is most stars aren't in those favorable positions in a galaxy. We have a star that has the right composition, the right mass, and was formed at the right time in the age of the universe. The odds of that are 1 in 100, and so on. And these are the 7 characteristics out of the 14 that we know enough about other planets to be able to put numbers on how likely it is that some other planet would meet the same conditions as the Earth in these categories. The 7 other conditions, like the planet having the right magnetic field and the right atmosphere and plate tectonics and so forth, we don't know enough about exoplanets to put numbers on that. But we do have these numbers, and we don't know exactly how to combine these. If they were all independent properties, and they seem to be independent. I mean, a planet having the right mass seems to be pretty much independent of where you started in the galaxy and what type of star you have and so forth. if they were really completely independent, then you would multiply all these numbers together, and you would find that matching these 7 of the 14 characteristics of Earth is as unlikely as 1 part in 100 billion. 1 part in 100 billion. So while the media is fond of saying that they found a habitable planet, what they're really talking about is this characteristic here, that the planet is receiving the right amount of starlight so that water could be liquid on its surface. They're not talking, they haven't measured all the other properties of the planet, and so they're not making those comparisons. And it's a lot easier to find 1 in 20 than 1 in 100 billion. Anyway, a lot of math here, and I turned to the Chief Technology Officer of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is much more eloquent and succinct than I am. And he said simply, good planets are hard to find. And since that's one of his main jobs, I take it that he's an expert in that statement. He says it with wisdom, and he followed that immediately, and he gave this lecture at Caltech, and he followed that immediately by saying, we need to take care of this one because none of us are going anywhere else. So now I want to turn to the most significant part of the talk that I want to give, and I want to talk about DNA. This is the way that in which we store the recipe of our life. This is the way in which we store the information to create the millions of protein molecules that our bodies produce that sustain every aspect of our existence. Okay, it turns out that every life form on Earth that's been examined has DNA that has the same general structure. It's a so-called double helix, which means it has the form of a ladder that's been twisted. So you have rails of the ladder, which are on the outside, and you have rungs on the ladder, which connect the rails across. So the rails are winding back and forth in this image here, and the rungs are the struts that link the rails together. These are sugar molecules that form the rails, and the rungs are formed by nucleotide base pairs, and we're going to talk about what that means later. So it turns out that your recipe of life is spelled out in a code that has a 4-letter alphabet, A, C, G, and T. And the combinations of those amino acid nucleotide base pairs is the recipe that defines all of the proteins that your body is going to produce. And there are billions of these things in the human body. This piece of DNA that you see here is only 12 segments long. And from such a small piece of DNA, one could not be able to tell whether this was an elephant or an amoeba. Okay, so there are 4 nucleotide base pairs that encode the recipe of our existence. And they are A, T, C, and G. And I won't bother trying to pronounce the names. And you notice that A and T always match up. It could be T on the left and A on the right, but they always match up together because they join with 2 bonds, 2 dotted lines here. Whereas C and G, they could also be left and right exchanged. They have 3 bonds that join them. So there's always this matching of the CG and the AT. And that is essential when the DNA wants to replicate, because then the 2 strands separate and each of them forms the missing partner on the other side. So every A will find a T to join up with and so forth, and every C will find a G and vice versa. So these are, each of these is an amino acid, and there are about 21 amino acids in a human body. Some life forms have 1 or 2 other amino acids that we don't. Some have fewer than we do, and so forth. So altogether, life on Earth has something, a number of different amino acids that's a number in the low 20s. I don't know about all the rest of them, but these four have a particularly interesting property, and that is they easily mutate. If you take a T, which has a hydrogen atom connected to this nitrogen, and you move that hydrogen atom one bond unit, which is really the smallest change you could make in a molecule, you have moved a single proton, a single atom away, then you get a different type of thymine, the enol type as opposed to the keto type, and the enol type has 3 bonds instead of 2. So the enol type will bond with guanine and instead of adenine. So this is a mutation. So if you make the smallest possible molecular change, you have changed the genetic code of future generations. And this is true, I show it here for the T, but all of the others have the equivalent property that they can easily mutate. This is called a tautometric mutation. The simplest possible change in the molecule will result in a different genetic code than the original molecular form. So by choosing these, it has accentuated the possibility of mutations, which is an interesting situation because most mutations are fatal. But on the other hand, if you didn't have mutations, you would never have the adaptation of organisms making themselves more and more fit generation after generation, right? I mean, an elephant is a wonderful solution to Darwin's challenge, and so is an amoeba. They're very different solutions, but they're both the best at what they do. And they're the best at what they do because there have been billions of years of these mutations, and Darwin has selected the fittest to survive and reproduce. So it's interesting that these molecules, which are essential to the recipe, are the ones that are the easiest for to change the recipe in. Okay, so anyway, in almost every cell in a human body, you have a complete set of human DNA. And one complete set of human DNA has 3.2 billion nucleotide base pairs that contain a total of 100 billion atoms. And that is an enormous amount of complexity. Indeed, 3.2 billion letter codes, there's a 4-letter code, and you have 3.2 billion of them. That's enough characters to fill 1,500 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, if you were born after the internet, you probably don't know what the Encyclopedia Britannica is because Wikipedia's got everything, right? But before the internet, and many of you are old enough to have seen an Encyclopedia Britannica in your life. Before the internet, the Encyclopedia Britannica was, let's say, more or less the greatest compendium of all human knowledge, right? But it was 24 volumes and maybe it covered 4 feet on the shelf of a bookcase. Well, what your DNA has is 1,500 volumes of a book of similar size. It's enormously complex, enormously complex. It is, in fact, the most complex and the most precise structure that scientists have discovered anywhere in the entire universe. Now, 100 billion is in the ballpark of the number of stars in a galaxy. It's a big number, but you know, galaxies have that many stars, so it's comparable. But the key difference is if you take 10% of the stars on the left side of the galaxy, you swap them with 10% of the stars on the right side of the galaxy, it isn't going to make a lot of difference. The galaxy is going to keep spinning around and probably it won't matter at all. But you take even a few atoms in your DNA and you move them around and you're dead. I mean, it really has to be correct. For you to exist as an organism, your DNA really has to come up with the right recipe. And we have that recipe because millions and billions of generations of our ancestors refined the recipe through the process of natural selection. And finally, I would like to point out that every human's DNA is 99.9% the same as every other human's DNA. That's the 99.9% that defines us to be human. The 0.1% is what either gives us blue eyes or red hair or the other different characteristics that distinguish one individual from the other. But that's only 0.1%. The 99.9% is common to all of us on the planet. Okay, so obviously we are a very complex form of life, and we're certainly not the first form of life. So what could the first form of life be? What is the simplest form of life that we might try to create by some accidental chemical process? Well, J. Craig Venter, who's one of the world's leading genomists, ran a major research project on this question, and he had a very strong financial motivation for doing so. He wanted to create new forms of bacteria that eat oil spills, that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and various other social projects. And he needs to make trillions and trillions of these new bacteria in order to have an impact on a global scale. And so he wanted to have the simplest living thing that he could have that was self-sustaining. And he spent 10 years trying to figure out what that was. And he estimates that you cannot have a self-sustaining life form with less than 462,000 nucleotide base pairs. We have 3.2 billion. So obviously we're a lot more complicated than that. But according to J. Craig Venter, this is the fewest number of nucleotide base pairs that a self-sustaining life form can have. Now, the first form of life certainly had to be self-sustaining. It couldn't have been a parasite because there was nothing else to be parasitic upon. So the first form of life had to be self-sustaining. So this is a reasonable estimate at a lower number for simplicity, and even that is enormously complex. Every 3 nucleotide base pairs forms what is called a codon, and each codon selects one of 21 amino acids for the assembly of a protein. So you get the first 3 nucleotide base pairs give you the first amino acid in the protein, the next 3 give you the second, and so on. And all of these little triplets end up defining all the amino acids in each of the proteins that your body needs to make. So this number of nucleotide base pairs is capable of defining an enormous number of possible proteins, an enormous number of different sequences of amino acids. And how big is the number of amino acids that it can define? It's a number that is so great that it's very difficult in the English language to tell you how big it is. And I think perhaps the best description is this number has 203,622 digits. The number is not 200,000. The number has 200,000 digits. If you wrote the number out, it would fill an entire book. That's how complicated the DNA of the simplest form of life is. Okay, well, that's a huge number. But our universe is very old. Our universe is very vast. The question is it possible in any time in the history of the universe, at any place in the entire universe, is it possible that something as complicated as that was formed by random chance? That's the question I want to focus on in this talk. Okay, so how can we go about this? I mean, no one was there recording the history. We don't know what all the biochemical processes are. I'm approaching this from the point of view that I don't have to know how to make a cell membrane. I just have to know how much DNA is required to make a cell membrane, and I have to figure out how likely it is that you can make that DNA, okay? So we will do what physicists call a back of the envelope calculation. And this is my own calculation. This is where many other people would call me crazy. But this is a back of the envelope calculation. It's a fine tradition in the history of physics. If we want to make an estimate of whether some phenomena is important to some other process or not, then we do a very rough calculation. We hope to get within a factor of 10 of the right answer. And most often you will either find out that it's way too small or way too big. If you find out that it's close to being possible, then you need to go back and make a very careful calculation. But before you spend all the time and effort on a very careful calculation, it's easier, it's advisable to start off with this back of the envelope approach and see if you're in the right ballpark. And since we don't know what all the parameters were at all to begin with, we have very little choice but to do it this way. So I'm going to calculate the very largest possible number of chances that chemicals came together in whatever form you choose with the possibility of creating the simplest DNA of the simplest life. Okay? I'm going to calculate the maximum number of possible interactions, and we're going to compare that to how many possibilities that DNA presents. And we will find out that the DNA is vastly more complicated than anything that could have been created by random chance, as I'll demonstrate now. Okay, if we took all the carbon atoms in the observable universe, and we use those to make the maximum number of DNA base pairs, and if we assume that all the atoms of all the other types on the periodic table are available in whatever abundance we need, and carbon is the only limitation, then the number of nucleotide base pairs we could create is a number that has 75 digits. I will also assume that all of these nucleotide base pairs exist in an ideal habitat. So there is no mortality. I count every spot in the entire universe as being an ideal habitat, including the center of the sun and the vastness of outer space. So this is, you know, way crazy that that everything in the universe is habitable, but I'm choosing the very best scenario. That's my objective. And I'm going to assume that all of these nucleotide base pairs can interact in any way you choose, any way you want, and they interact 1 billion times a second. And they really can't interact that fast, or they certainly can't interact any faster than that, because molecules that big can't move that fast without tearing themselves to pieces. But anyway, we're going for the very best case. And I'm going to assume that all of these nucleotide base pairs existed at the instant of the Big Bang, and they have been interacting 1 billion times a second from then until now. That's as much time as exists. So that's the number of seconds in the age of the universe is a number that has 18 digits. So you multiply all of these together, which means you simply add the exponents, and you find out that the maximum number of interactions of nucleotide base pairs in any combination you want, with 0 mortality assumed, for the entire age of the universe, for the entire expanse of the universe, is a number that has 102 digits. 102. That's the number of possibilities that could have been explored by random chemistry and physics throughout the entire age and expanse of the entire observable universe. So this is the number that you would have to explore in order to find that the recipe of the simplest life, a number that has 203,000 digits. This is the number of interactions that could have occurred to produce that recipe of the simplest life. And so you divide the number of the search volume by the number of interactions. When you divide, you just subtract the exponents. And so the odds of making the simplest DNA, even once, anywhere in the entire universe, through any known chemical or physical process, the odds against that are 1 in a number that has 203,520 digits. In other words, you didn't change anything. This is a fabulously large number, and it's almost impossible to change it. Let's say that I wanted to say that the universe was a trillion times bigger and had that many more atoms. That's 10 trillions. That's 120 digits. If I said that instead of this, I would have 203,400 digits. I haven't changed the answer. You know, I made it 120 digits shorter, but I haven't changed the magnitude of the answer. The answer still remains, any way you cut it, that it's simply impossible to come up with a notion for how the simplest DNA could have been formed by some random chemical process. Now you might say, you know, a very good criticism of this would be that J. Craig Venter didn't find the simplest life. There is an even simpler life than the one he described. And let's assume, for sake of argument, that that simpler life was 0.03% simpler. Just a little bit simpler, right? Now, if it was 0.03% simpler, then instead of having 200,000 odd digits, it would have 61 fewer digits. That's 0.03% of 203,000. Okay, what does this mean? Since we believe life on Earth formed in no more than 600 million years, if you assume that life formed through some random chemical or physical process, then this simpler life would be easier to form by 61 digits, 61 powers of 10, because it has a simpler DNA than J. Craig Venter's DNA. So if that were true, if J. Craig Venter's DNA was created within 600 million years, then this life would form 100 times per second in every cubic centimeter of water across the entire surface of the Earth. It would fill the oceans. It would fill every test tube in every lab. It would just be jumping out because it would be so much more likely to occur than what did occur. But where is it? No biologist has ever found it. No oceanographer has ever seen a life that has a DNA that's simpler than J. Craig Venter said. So I think this is a logical argument that says that the life that we've described is probably the simplest way to define life that exists. That there cannot be a life form which is vastly simpler than the one we see. If it were, then it would populate the planet, not us. So, I'm certainly not trying to prove that life is impossible. Clearly it is. So the question is, how then did life begin if it can't be a random chemical process that we are currently familiar with? That is ruled out by 203,000 factors of 10. Now, science has faced dilemmas on this magnitude in the past. There was no explanation for lightning. There was no explanation for the ultraviolet catastrophe of thermodynamics. There was no explanation for why atoms are stable until someone made a great discovery. And it may be that there is a completely natural explanation, and someone will one day make a great discovery, and we will eventually be able to understand how life evolved. But that hasn't happened yet. So all the current attempts to explain the origin of life really are missing the mark by 203,000 factors of 10. And I just hope that within my lifetime, somebody is going to make that breakthrough, because it's going to change science forever, as did the solution to the ultraviolet catastrophe and the stability of atoms. So getting back to the pale blue dot, I tell you that every bit of our existence is remarkably special. That we exist in a universe with finely tuned knobs that make our universe viable, that we exist in one of the most benign galaxies in that universe, that we are orbiting just a star with just the right mass, with just the right composition, that formed at the right time in the history of the universe, that we are on a planet with extraordinary features that are supportive of life, that we are made of the most precious ingredients that the universe has struggled for 14 billion years to produce, and that our storage mechanism for the recipe of our life, the DNA, is the most exquisite structure that has ever been discovered by science. And so in conclusion, I say what all of my grandchildren have always known: life is good. Thank you very much.
Now we'll take some questions.
So when I came to Mount Diablo Astronomical Society in the past, I offered all of you guys my books, and you were very kind. And now I can't hand them to you, but in place of that, I will provide free shipping to any member of the Mount Diablo Astronomical Society that chooses to buy any of these books. So this is a book which is a general introduction to all of modern science, relativity, quantum mechanics, cosmology. This is a book that describes the talk I gave tonight, and it includes information about the properties of the universe and the properties of the planet that we didn't have time for tonight. This is a book in which I make the case that science and faith are compatible. I don't know if you can see the image, but this is Albert Einstein reaching out to touch the finger of God. This is my tongue-in-cheek replacement for the roof of the Sistine Chapel, where Adam is touching the finger of God. And so if you buy, you can see the prices of these books, and that's inclusive of shipping. Okay, so questions? Does that mean you understood everything, or you understood nothing?
I'm sorry, how do we explain Donald Trump?
Well, with 3.2 billion nucleotide base pairs, a very large combination of possibilities.
Well said.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
My question is, explain to me your rationale behind assuming that reactions are random only. It seems like atoms are attracted by electronic forces.
Yes, they are. But you would have, you see, the nucleotide base pairs join each other, and they all combinations of nucleotide base pairs fit in with the sugar molecules that form the rails of DNA. So every combination of that code has essentially the same energy level. So there isn't a preference for having, for instance, 3 C's in a row or 15 C's in a row or anything like that. The code of DNA is free to be all the combinations with nearly equal probability.
Thank you.
Somebody else isn't going to ask, I'll try one. If you were to take and create something that was self-replicating and just by randomness, it would continue to self-replicate, but maybe add additional things onto it. Wouldn't that change the mathematics?
Well, you try to use the logic of Darwin and you apply it to the formation of the first life, then you still have to explain how the different combinations that you might want to produce result in a favorable advantage, right? Because, I mean, Darwin's evolution is driven by natural selection to identify the best existing species, the best existing members of that species. So you select and refine and refine and refine because each stage along the way yields a favorable survival advantage. I don't see how you can apply that logic to things that aren't alive, because there's no advantage to a molecule adding the right stuff as opposed to the wrong stuff if there's no definition of what's right, what's favorable.
I guess my question more is, does that change the math? Not as is that?
Well, you'd have to put down, you'd have to establish some sort of logic as to how this is going to happen, and then we would know how much it changes the math. But recall that you're talking about 200,000 factors of 10. If you made something 10 times easier, it doesn't matter. You still have 200,000 factors of 10 to overcome. You could make it a trillion times easier, and I could say that 1,000 times. A trillion, I could say 1,000 times. And that's not good enough. You would still be left with over 100,000 digits. That number is stupendous. And I'd be happy to have people make arguments about why it's too big, but in fact, I've chosen the most optimistic scenario for the number of interactions. So, the number of actual interactions is probably, has only 10 digits as opposed to what I claim is 102. And again, that's irrelevant because you're facing 200,000 digits as the challenge. If I had to make a wild guess, and I don't have any theory to back this up, but just a gut feel, when you're looking for a really weird answer in physics, you should be looking at quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics is a weird theory, and it's filled with all sorts of weird results. One of my professors at Caltech, Richard Feynman, said famously that he believed that no one in the world really understood quantum mechanics. So
we have a couple of questions here that have been typed in on the chat. One is, what is the advantage of the asteroid belt?
Well, I think a lot of leading astrobiologists believe that the asteroids delivered water to the surface of the Earth. And they did so because the planet Jupiter moved toward the sun by about 5% during the evolution of our solar system. And in doing so, it dislodged about 99% of all the material that was in the asteroid belt originally. And a lot of that material fell inwards toward the center of gravity, and the Earth is in the way of a certain amount of that. The asteroids are in the snow, they're past the snow line in the solar system, so they are a place where water would accumulate as frozen ice, And that is the mechanism, we believe, that delivered water to the surface of the Earth. Because when the Earth was formed, it was molten rock. And any water that was part of that assembly would have floated to the surface because it's much lighter than rock, and it would have been vaporized. And in fact, the hydrogen and oxygen would have been dissociated, and the hydrogen would have floated off into space because the Earth's not massive enough for its gravity to hold back hydrogen from escaping from the top of the atmosphere. So it seems reasonably likely that the early Earth all by itself would have been completely devoid of water on its surface, which of course wouldn't be conducive to life. The number that I calculate there, that I listed there at 1 in 250, was estimated by astrobiologists at UC Berkeley. It's not a number I invented.
And there's another question about using another core atom other than carbon, such as silicon. I think you answered that.
Well, silicon forms beautiful crystals that you could use to make semiconductors with, but it doesn't form long molecules. So carbon is the only atom on the periodic table of elements, and therefore the only atom. I mean, we know what the particles of nature are. We know what you can put together, how you can put together those particles to make atoms. We know what all possible atoms are. And the only one that we know of that can form a long molecule, anything bigger than 12 atoms, is carbon.
We have another comment that one issue with Ventnor's estimate of the minimum number of base pairs for life is that a simpler life form may be extinct, as 99% of all species have been over time.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. The calculation that I made showed that if life indeed evolved through some, by random luck, through existing chemical and physical processes that are known to science, then a simpler life would reoccur 100 times per second in every cubic centimeter of water on Earth. So it could go extinct, it doesn't matter, it's going to come back again.
So to put this in simpler terms, you've presented some pretty astronomical odds, and I'm sorry if that's a bad pun, but it's the best way I know to describe it. But some pretty astronomical odds that life did not form by chance. So the obvious conclusion to that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is some intelligent form out there which is turning these 20 knobs or 35 knobs or however many knobs exist to the right settings to create life. Is that a valid statement?
Well, that is an answer, and it's a satisfying answer for many people. It's not a satisfying answer for other people, and it's probably not the only answer, but it is an answer. And there's no argument that I can give you that says it's the wrong answer. Certainly there are life forms in the universe that are much more intelligent than we are. I think every astronomer would agree that there's an unlimited number of planets out there, and that some of them have to be habitated like we are, like Earth is, and it would be ridiculous of us to adopt the position that we are smarter than any of those possible life forms out there. If you imagine a human today who came to Earth 30,000 years ago, that human would appear to be a god, right? I mean, think of what we can do today that we couldn't do 30,000 years ago. I mean, we fly through the air faster than the fastest bird. Our craft go through the water faster than the fastest fish. We build buildings that are taller than you can see the top of. We landed on the moon, for God's sakes, right? I mean, even a species that's as intelligent as we are, 30,000 years ago, we were very primitive. And if someone with a little bit more advanced society than we were 30,000 years ago appeared on Earth, why would we not call them gods? So if you believe that there's this big universe out there and that life exists everywhere, then God has to exist in some sense. It may not be the God that's described in the Old Testament or the New Testament or the Quran or something else, but it would be functionally a God. It would be a creature that has capabilities that we cannot even dream of having. I mean, we have the power of life and death. We can resurrect people that are legally dead in certain cases. We can take the heart from one person and put it into another person. I mean, it's amazing what we have learned to do in 30,000 years. Why would not other people be even better than that? Other people, other creatures. So the notion that science should reject the existence of God as being superstitious nonsense, which a lot of scientists take that position, I think is completely unjustified.
We have another question in the chat. But where would that more advanced life form have come from? How did that life form?
I don't know, it's sort of like the multiverse, right? We explain the existence of our universe because it popped up from the multiverse, but that doesn't explain where the multiverse comes from. We're just kicking the can down the road. I think that there may well be a scientific explanation for the origin of life. My point is we are nowhere close to being able to explain it. And science can only advance when we recognize what we don't know and go after it. If we sit back and think we know everything, then we're not going to work on new discoveries. We developed quantum mechanics because thermodynamics had a problem. If we had simply ignored the problem, we wouldn't have quantum mechanics. We wouldn't have understood atoms. We wouldn't have digital electronics or computers or any of the modern technologies. We make advances because we're unsatisfied with the status quo. And I think the notion that we can simply say Darwin, 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 and that's what life came from, that's sweeping a very interesting question under the rug. My point of view is that science is light years away from understanding this very interesting question of where life came from. And we should face up to that squarely and go after it. I don't know how to do it. It's, you know, I'm not a specialist in biology, but I know enough math to see that there's a problem of stupendous magnitude. No scientist I know likes what I said, but none of them has told me that my math is wrong.
Any other questions? Here's a comment. It is the height of hubris to expect that a carbon-based life form can interpret the existence of another type of life form.
I would argue that all life forms are carbon-based.
Yes, you did.
Now,
Any
you
other
could argue that a robot might be alive, and I can't give good arguments either way for whether or not robots are alive. So I was talking about biological life. A robot clearly could not be the first form of life.
Any other questions, anybody? Otherwise, we're going to call it, folks.
Are we not then robots?
If that was a question, I didn't hear it.
Are we not then robots?
Are we not then robots? I think we're not. I mean, robot is a word that humans invented, right? And the intention of inventing that word was to distinguish that entity from us.
A robot may be a generated life form.
Well, if you took a bacteria and you changed its DNA so that it was something else, or a different type of bacteria, doesn't have to be a radical change. That wouldn't be a robot, would it?
Depends
I mean,
on
a
whether
robot-
depends on whether it's at the service of the creator.
I think the intention of the word robot was an abiotic mechanism that can perform human-like functions. But one would have to look at, the word robot comes from Asimov? Somebody knows more about science fiction than I do, I'm sure, here. Where does the word robot come from?
I think it came before Asimov, but I'm not sure.
He did write the book on robots.
Yeah. He wrote a lot of great books.
And the three laws of robotics.
Okay, before we get down this rabbit hole, other questions? Dr. Piccioni. If
Well,
not, we're going to call it.
I'd like to thank all of you for attending this talk and inviting me back. And it was once again a great pleasure to visit with the Mount Diablo astronomers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you very
It was
much.
very thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I ask a question? Now, it has nothing to do with your presentation. Are we done?